Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking some time to join this webinar session on AML KYC. It's something we've been planning for quite a while now, trying to organize this webinar, and I think Tim will testify the fact that it's been a long process having to get him on this, get him to do this presentation for us. But we really want to appreciate Tim for his time to do this training, this webinar session. I'm quite optimistic that it will be very productive for you who have taken your time to join to this webinar. And so we'll be looking at a few things. I don't want to start what Tim will just repeat what Tim is going to say, but it's been put together by Like Minds. We are an African networking platform based in the UK, and we support one another via training, manpower development, job enrichment, and we support one another because we do have some peculiar challenges when we came to the UK to settle and also to work. So we provide that network to support each other to ensure we are gainfully employed and we are the best at what we do. So this is one of our initiatives. It's some of our giving back initiatives, and we use it as a platform to enrich our members and also the members of the public, and also throw some awareness into who we are and how we could be of support to you should you want to be a part of Like Minds. Okay. At this junction, without just one or two housekeeping rules, ensure your phone, your computer, if you're using your phone, is muted at all times. You are free to open your cameras. I think by that way we could interact with you even more and see your lovely faces. Also, ensure your phone is muted when you are talking. I think be careful about the background noise and all that. So that'll be very, very helpful to ensure that there are no distractions during this webinar process. So I will then now, without further ado, inviting Tyler to start the process, introduce himself, and also go from there. Tim.
Okay, well, good evening, and thank you, John. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you. And I hope to share some thoughts, some insight about some of the challenges that we currently face in the context of financial crime. Of course, that will include customer due diligence, but I'm hoping to go a little bit more widely and look at some of the other threats and challenges that we face, particularly at the moment. So can I briefly introduce myself so you know who's on the other side of the camera? I'm going to briefly introduce the International Compliance Association that I represent, and then we'll make a start and I'll talk about a range of different challenges and threats in the context of financial crime. So first of all, ICA, International Compliance Association. Very briefly, you may have heard of us. We have a global footprint, although we're headquartered within the United Kingdom. We've delivered training to over 100,000 students all around the world in the context of financial crime compliance, governance, and risk. And that training, which I'll touch on very briefly at the end of this presentation, but that training runs from certificate level all the way through to postgraduate diploma. So a little bit about myself, as I say, so you know who's on the other side of the camera. I've been with the ICA for the last 4.5 years. I'm currently the head of financial crime compliance for the organization. Prior to that, I worked for a number of years in the Gambling Commission here in the UK, where I was head of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing for effectively having oversight for the industry. Prior to that, I worked for 30 years in law enforcement, early on in the City of London, where I believe some of you are currently working. Subsequent to that, I moved to Cheshire, from Cheshire to the National Crime Squad. National Crime Squad became part of the Serious Organised Crime Agency, which in time was renamed as the National Crime Agency. Now, over those 30 years, the fight against financial crime was the one common theme that I kept on coming back to. Early on, as an investigator, dealing with fraud, money laundering, and corruption, and towards the end of my career, working at a more strategic level. So, for instance, in SOCA, the Serious Organised Crime Agency, I formed and I headed the Proceeds of Crime Operational Command. I had offices all around the UK and a number in strategic locations around the world. And we worked together to counter the threat of organised crime in the context of money laundering and asset recovery. And towards the end, in National Crime Agency, I was the head of UK International Crime Bureau. It meant that myself and my teams dealt with all criminal inquiries that were coming into the UK and leaving the UK to go overseas. And we also dealt with all fugitives issues. So that's more than enough about myself. I hope to learn a little bit about yourselves over the next hour, hour and a half. But I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to use this to structure the presentation that I'm about to give. So in a moment, I'm going to talk about what you can expect, but I'm just arranging the windows on my laptop so that I can see you as I do this. Here we are. I ought to say that I'm sitting at home in my study. There's a big screen on the right-hand side, which is the presentation is shown on. But I've also got, I've logged in through my iPhone, so that means that I can see what you can see as the student. Okay, so what are we going to cover then over the next hour or so? And where is there opportunity, I think, for you to contribute to these issues? Well, we begin with a focus on financial crime itself. We're going to look at the nature of financial crime that's impacting the UK. We'll, I hope, unpack some of the numbers and get a feel for the extent of the current threat facing the UK from a wide variety of different financial crimes. We'll then look at the global context, and it's very hard not to talk about the current pandemic. What's the impact of this pandemic in the context of financial and wider forms of crime? We'll look at some reports that have highlighted the way in which that threat is changing, and we'll consider the impact in the context of customer due diligence and other financial crime compliance requirements. Then I want to talk about Brexit. It seems to have gone a little bit quiet, hasn't it, about Brexit? After all the noise and the hysteria about the fact that we were leaving the European Union, I think all of that has been put into perspective by the larger global threat from the pandemic. And there's little thought around what's going on. But of course, it is going on. There's movement, there's continued developments around our relationship with the EU. And it raises interesting questions around what the regulatory relationship will be between the UK and the wider European Union. Will there, for instance, be an alignment of regulations? And that's going to have an impact on us. It will equally have an impact across the rest of the EU. So we're going to talk about that briefly. Then I want to talk about how the UK is developing its response to the threat of financial crime. At a strategic level, the government published in the summer of last year a document that set out its commitment to fight financial crime and a number of key priorities contained within that. So I want to explore that with you. And then finally, I'm going to talk about emerging technologies. Now, this, I believe, is fascinating. I'm really interested to hear from you if any of you are involved in developing or implementing new technologies in the context of compliance or wider financial services. Of course, there are a number of technologies that have an impact here, and I'd like to share that with you, and I hope to a small extent demystify that. So that's the intention. I'd encourage you to ask any questions as we go along, but having said that, there's an opportunity to gather up any questions that you have in around about an hour's time. So you may feel actually it's a better use of our time for you to save up those questions until about an hour from now. Gosh, that sounds like a long time to be talking. So I hope that doesn't drag out for you, and I hope I can keep it interesting and move it along fairly quickly. But we start with a focus on financial crime. If I asked you, I wonder what you would say the main threats from financial crime are. What's the extent of it here in the United Kingdom? What's the extent of fraud or money laundering? Of course, it's very difficult to determine this. There are various figures that have been published, but they are at best very deep. Yeah, okay, I mean, absolutely agree. Very significant levels of financial crime, certainly. But it's at best a guess. We don't really know the extent of financial crime. And of course, that's in large part because it is beneath the radar. But we have got some numbers that I'd like to share with you now. So here's one statistic from an economic crime survey published by PricewaterhouseCoopers. 50% of individuals have experienced economic crime within the last 24 months. So that on its own speaks of a really significant threat. It's something that's very present in our lives. And interestingly, and I came from the police, as I said before, and I have some responsibility around this, but the reality is, if you're subject to a fraud or to many other types of financial crime, it's very unlikely that you're going to have a proper and full response from law enforcement. And the reason for that is the sheer volume of fraud. 3.47 million cases during 2018. That's according to the National Audit Office. So an overwhelming amount of fraud. And the police simply don't have the resources to investigate it all. If they did, the prosecution service can't prosecute it. And if they could, the courts certainly couldn't handle it. And then, well, the prisons would all be full within days if they were able to take it all before the courts. So much of this goes unrecognized and uninvestigated. Vast amounts of fraud taking place here within the UK. And it generates dirty money, not just from fraud, of course, but dirty money that flows from drugs, from human trafficking, from wildlife crime, from a host of different criminal activities. It's been estimated at something like £150 billion a year flowing through our financial services. And that, of course, in large part, is where many of you are working in the City of London. That figure comes from a shared platform between the director of the Serious Fraud Office, Mark Thompson, and the director of Prosperity, which is the part of the National Crime Agency dealing with economic crime. That was Donald Toon, and that was in the summer of last year, July 2019. So a huge amount of money. I talk to people all over the world, and I very often will ask, well, where is money laundering taking place? Where do you see money laundering focusing, concentrating around the world? And there are places like Dubai that certainly spring to mind. To a lesser extent, places like maybe Shanghai and Beijing. Of course, John, who invited me this evening, would have an interest in. But many parts of the world are affected by financial crime. But so often when I ask this question, people will say London. London, there's so much dirty money flowing through the city of London. And this, of course, raises a question about what are we doing in response to this? So how is UK law enforcement, how's the UK government getting on in terms of the recovery of that vast amount of this? You'll know, I expect, that there's a range of different legislative provisions that allow police courts to recover criminal proceeds. It can be confiscated. There's now power to confiscate houses, money on account, if it's believed to have come from crime. This historically has been a flagship issue for many governments. Politically, it's very powerful to say, well, we're taking money back from the criminals and we're reinvesting it in the communities that those criminals have harmed. So a great deal of emphasis in terms of legislation, in terms of law enforcement capability and the like. A great deal of emphasis is placed around recovering assets. But I want to ask, how much are we getting back? What proportion of criminal assets are we able to recover? I don't know what your thoughts are. I don't know what you would see an acceptable proportion to be. 50%, 30%, maybe 10% of criminal assets? So I'm not going to ask you that because perhaps it would be unfair. But the true figure is 0.089%. I did some maths on this, and in fact, I think I mentioned I used to work leading at a national level in terms of asset recovery when I worked in soccer. And I've seen firsthand how difficult it is to recover assets. But even so, this figure is woeful. I derived this number by looking at the overall size of the criminal economy from a number of different sources. I use National Audit Office and Treasury in terms of the one-off, and you see it comes out at less than 0.1%. And the interesting thing is, if you look more widely across the rest of the world, the United Nations has estimated it's between 0.1 and 0.2% that's recovered. So we all have a long way to go in terms of getting the criminal funds back from the criminals. But there's another area that you may be perhaps more familiar with, and that is suspicious activity reporting. So you'll know, I expect, that there is a duty to report suspicion of money laundering and terrorist financing. That doesn't just apply to financial services, although about half of suspicious activity reports come from banks. That applies to all regulated entities. So if you encounter suspicion, you're required by law to report it. How many? Well, nearly 500,000 reports of money laundering and terrorist financing suspicion were reported during the last period that we have on record, which was 2018. Huge amounts of information, rich intelligence about money laundering and terrorist financing. And yet, we struggle to do anything with this intelligence. We only get a 0.089% back. Those suspicious activity reports generate just a handful of arrests. And you may be aware that there's a current focus, not just in the UK, but across the world, around how we approach anti-money laundering. And so, sorry, I'm going to pause there. Joey, you've asked, am I going to talk about the impact? And I couldn't see the rest of your query, so I'm just going to call that up now. And I'm going to bring it over here. Are you guys talking about the impact of RPA solutions for combating financial crime? So RPA solutions, help me. What do you mean there?
That's
Joe?
robotic process automation.
Ah, yes, I am.
Robots, yeah.
Yes, I am. Let me. So you'll have to be patient. I will come to that.
Mm.
But right now, I'm setting the scene. If you can bear with me, Joe, is that all right? If I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So we see vast amounts of reporting, but we're not seeing the ability of law enforcement to really do anything meaningful with all that intelligence. And of course, that's a really nice segue into talk about artificial intelligence and other new technologies, which we're going to come back to in a little while. So moving on, I want to talk about a report. And this particular report, which has been published by Transparency International, highlights some of the threats facing the UK in the context of financial crime. So I'm going to develop a little further our understanding of the threat using this report. Now, the report's available online. It's readily accessible. If you simply search on at your service and Transparency International, it will bring it back. And the report focuses on 400 cases. So the organization, Transparency International, which is a global organization with a very strong presence in the United Kingdom, this considered 400 cases and unpacked them in detail to understand how the financial crime had taken place, what was exploited, what were the different methodologies that were being used. And you can see a summary of what they found here. So across those 400 cases, 86 different banks were involved. 81 law firms. I think that's a really interesting number, really high number of law firms, and 62 accountancy businesses, nearly over 2,000 different companies. So some really interesting insights around what's going on in the context of financial crime. But I want to focus on one in particular, which I find absolutely fascinating. And that is a type of money laundering that's highlighted in this report. And it's worth just spending a few minutes to unpack the way in which this works. You may be familiar with it. It's called the global laundromat. It's also been called the Moldavian laundromat. And it's a way in which tens of billions of dollars in value was laundered from Russia, from Moscow, into the West. And it was a brilliant, a really clever form of money laundering. So it's worth just spending a few minutes to unpack that now. It's something that we're increasingly seeing in London, and it's increasingly coming before the courts in London. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to explain the nature of this particular money laundering scheme. And I'm going to use this diagram to do it. So 3 companies are set up. All of them are under the control of the criminals. Okay, was that someone coming in there? No, okay, I'm going to carry on. So all of these 3 companies are criminals. And you can see that one is in London, one is in Moscow, and a third is in Moldova. And so what the criminals do is they arrange for a paper loan to take place, let's say for $10 million, from company A to company B in Moldova. So a paper trail is raised that reflects a loan. Whether the money changes hands, it doesn't really matter, because all of these companies are under the control of the same criminal group. So that loan takes place, and company C becomes the guarantor for the loan. It guarantees the loan. So then what happens is company B refuses, on paper, refuses or defaults on repayment against that loan. So now company A approaches company C, because company C is the guarantor, and naturally it asks for the repayment of the full $10 million. Company C refuses, and all of this is taken to court. Now, it's taken to court typically in places like Moldova because of the link through Company B, and the court then orders Company C to repay $10 million to Company A in London. So hopefully you can see what has now happened. It means that in practice, you've got $10 million arriving into accounts in London, and you've got an explanation for why those funds have arrived. So when the bank for Company A says, that's a lot of money, why have you just received $10 million from Moscow? Then Company A will say, well, it's a court order. In fact, here is the court order. In fact, on some occasions, those $10 million are actually paid onto the accounts for the court. The court then recovers the amount and pays it to Company A. So the funds then are coming from a court into the company. And so the banks for Company A are persuaded that this is perfectly legal. Why else would Company A be receiving it if it's been through the courts, whether that's in Moldova, but we're also seeing the courts in London being used for the same system. So for me, this is a really fascinating form of money laundering, really difficult to counter. I met with some investigators from Moldova when I was working in soccer, and this must have been about 10 years ago now. And this was at the time when this form of money laundering was just starting to come to the surface. And I remember asking them about what they were investigating, and they were really struggling to understand it. A really complicated, difficult form of crime, and yet from the criminal perspective, so effective and so simple. But the same report also talks about some other indicators of financial crime. It's worth just touching on them very briefly. So we can see here some of the banks that were caught out just on this form of money laundering that I've just described. So you can see Citibank topping the list, but shortly afterwards, Royal Bank of Scotland, HSBC, a variety of different banks that were caught up in laundering these vast amounts of funds coming from Russia. But something else that we see is launderers will use concealed beneficial ownership. So this is where the launderers, the criminals, set up companies and use them as a vehicle to hide or move their stolen value, their assets. And with that in mind, it's interesting to see that some companies, or rather many companies, are registered to the same addresses. Why would you, for instance, have over 1,400 companies all registered to the same address in Birmingham? Well, it raises all sorts of questions, doesn't it? What's being hidden? Why isn't the company using its own address for its registration? Why does it need to use a company formation agent's address to do this? And this is typical of what we're seeing for money laundering. And the other thing, of course, that we're often seeing is the signing off of accounts, which is a requirement, of course, under Companies Act requirements, signing off of accounts by the same individuals. So here you've got one guy, Ali Mulai. He's signed off accounts for over 500 companies. You've got to ask, has he really got the bandwidth and the time to do sufficient due diligence around each of those 500 companies? So, and that's just on the 400 cases that Transparency International were looking at. So there, I hope, are some insights to the challenges that we face. I'm going to speed up a little now because I want to allow plenty of time to talk about emerging technologies, which are where I sense you're particularly interested. So I'm going to move through the next sections quite quickly so that we have plenty of time to do just that. But I have, I hope, set the scene. I provided some context around financial crime within the UK and elsewhere around the world. Briefly, What are we seeing currently in the context of COVID and the current pandemic? Well, you may have picked this up, but the first thing to say is actually we see one form of organized crime, the cartels, actually acting in the interests of local communities. Here in favelas in Rio de Janeiro, the cartels have been very active in enforcing lockdown provisions. So they have told residents in the favelas, you must stay at home. And we are enforcing this because the police aren't doing enough. So that's an interesting perspective around the way in which organized crime operates. Building bridges, building relationships with local communities by acting in their interests. But of course, they remain organized crime groups. And elsewhere around the world, we see a range of different reports and materials that give some insight to what organized crime is currently doing, how it is exploiting the current pandemic. One area is fraud, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. So a variety of different types of fraud, exploiting, for instance, the government support and investment schemes, exploiting the furlough arrangements, setting up false companies, false employees, in order to make claims against governments, and not just in the UK, but elsewhere around the world as well. Fraud against individuals, and there's a good example that we see on the next slide. I don't know if anyone here has received a message like this. It's asking for payment, apparently for a fine for breaching lockdown requirements. And it looks very genuine, but of course it's a complete fiction. It's come from fraudsters. And if you pay the £35, it's not going to the government, it's simply going to accounts controlled by the fraudsters. We're also seeing cybercrime. And oh, you've received such a text, John. Okay, thank you. That's interesting. So it is quite common, isn't it? I expect that there'll be more of us that have received these as well. So fraud is one particular area, but we're also seeing a growth in cybercrime, and that is absolutely not a surprise. Why are we seeing that growth in cybercrime? Well, of course, so many of us are having to work from home. So we are operating outside of our companies, our businesses, normal IT networks. And so at times that means that we can be outside of the security features, whether that's physical security or cyber security that protects our information and our exchange of communications. So criminals are exploiting that. They're also exploiting the uncertainty. So when people are starting to work from home, then maybe they're doing that for the first time ever. Maybe they're using a laptop dialed into their network for the first time. And criminals will exploit the uncertainty that creates. So for instance, they're contacting, they're reaching out to individuals saying that they are network administrators, wanting to help them set up their accounts locally. And of course, then asking them for passwords and other sensitive information. And because we're going through this state of transition, we're moving into different working arrangements, we are very much more vulnerable to that kind of suggestion. So cybercrime is also on the increase. And finally, domestic abuse. And I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that either, where individuals, families, groups are unable to leave the home. And in that confined space, it can facilitate violence or other forms of close relationship violence, whether that's against women or against men. But certainly we're seeing it growing. From France, for instance, the growth has been around 30% that's been reported. And you'll remember that the Home Secretary here in the UK talked about this in one of her briefings recently. So I'm going to move on I'm not going to dwell on FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, and the way in which this organization has responded to the threat, because we are a little short of time. But there's one thing I will draw attention to, and this particularly relates to customer due diligence, and that is the risk that as we are onboarding customers and we are unable to meet them, so we're doing this now remotely, sometimes for the first time, entirely remotely, then of course criminals will exploit that. They will use false identities and other means to attack banks and financial services. And FATF in this report is encouraging us to maintain our standards, to use the right tools to undertake customer due diligence, ensuring that we know who we're dealing with, even though we're unable to meet them face to face. You can see it also talks about the misuse of digital currencies, and that's something that we're going to come back to in a few minutes' time. I've talked about the potential for criminals to exploit economic stimuli, and another area that's picked up in this report is the way in which some financial services are being driven underground by the current crisis. So we've talked about context, the nature, extent of financial crime across the UK. We've talked briefly about the current threat around COVID and the way in which that's being exploited by organised crime. I'm going to touch briefly on Brexit, but it is going to be brief. So what I want to talk about is the way in which this is generating uncertainty across financial services. I expect this is hardly going to be a surprise to you. And the reality is we just don't know what the future holds. It's fair to say that there are capabilities that could be preserved, but potentially being broken up. So for instance, law enforcement capabilities, like I used to lead for the European arrest warrant. I also used to lead on the sharing of information across something called the Schengen Information System, which is across all of EU, enabling law enforcement to talk to each other. Now, at the moment, it looks like the UK is withdrawing from all of that. But I have to say, it doesn't need to, that there are other European countries that are outside of the EU, but that are nonetheless part of those arrangements that share information using the Schengen Information System. Countries like Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, they are all routinely taking part. So our government has a choice, and it could connect us to the EU, and there's certainly good reason to want to do that. But at the moment, the suggestion is that it won't. That's not to be critical of our government. It is a very complicated position that they're negotiating around. But something else that we've seen is around regulatory alignment. And there are some compelling arguments around this. Some of those arguments suggest that we should stay aligned to the EU. In doing that, we protect ourselves, we protect our reputation. It means that businesses looking to invest within the UK don't need to do any additional due diligence for any other country across the EU. It can be treated in exactly the same way. But if there isn't regulatory alignment, then that generates significant additional work. And with that, the potential for higher levels of financial crime, and therefore the potential for risk, for loss to corruption, or loss to other forms of financial crime. So this question of regulatory alignment is a significant one, but equally politically, of course, we came out of the EU in part because of a perception that the regulatory alignment with the EU was damaging to our national interests. So we're waiting to see how this plays out. And the last thing to say here is that there are a number of directives where the UK has fallen into line with the rest of the EU. Right up until the 10th of January this year, we were implementing provisions from EU money laundering directives. That means that we are aligned at a regulatory level. The question comes, what with the next directives? The 6th anti-money laundering directive or the 7th on the horizon? Will we implement those provisions? And if we don't, what will be the impact on our financial services? Okay, so that was very, very quick, moving through the issues around Brexit. I mentioned that I wanted to talk about the UK approach to financial crime compliance, but I'm going to skip past this so that we've got a little bit of time to talk about new technologies. What I would have talked about, and it's my fault, I didn't allow enough time, I would have talked about the government's strategic approach to counter the threat of financial crime. And that strategic approach is around building our understanding of the threat, enhancing powers, capabilities across law enforcement and the courts, ensuring regulatory activity and scrutiny across all of financial services and other forms of regulated activity, and addressing that issue around beneficial ownership that we were speaking about before. So I'm not going to dwell on this because we're a little short of time.
I think you can take extra 10, 15 minutes just so you don't rush into it.
Okay, so is it worth doing? So is it worth just pausing then?
Yeah.
Okay, well then I'll do that. I'll try and do it quickly because I don't want to take us over the allotted time. And I want to ensure that we can address that wider issue of emerging technologies. But coming back to this then, the Economic Crime Plan published by the UK government in the summer of last year, it focused on key priorities to enable a more joined up, collaborative approach to the threat of financial crime. And one of the key issues, and I find this absolutely fascinating, one of the key drivers contained in this document is around information sharing. So this enables banks and other financial services to share information. So using a capability that some of you may be familiar with, the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, or JMLIT, we now see banks sharing information routinely with other banks and also with law enforcement. This isn't through suspicious activity reporting. This is entirely different. It doesn't require a structured report to be sent to the FIU, a suspicious activity report. This actually enables banks to pick up the phone and talk to each other about what they're seeing, to build a picture of criminals activity where a number of different banks are involved. And it's seen as hugely successful. It's interesting to see that FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, is looking to use very similar arrangements in other countries and to support the development of similar initiatives in other countries around the world. Those people in the UK that have been involved in JMLIT, and I know one or two of them, have been to FATF, have been to other countries to talk about their experience, sharing information, and the impact that this can have. And so the government here in its strategic planning recognizes that and is looking to build upon it. Something else it wants to enhance is its understanding of the threat of financial crime. I think we saw at the beginning that it's very difficult to understand the extent of it, the nature of some forms of financial crime, how much corruption is taking place. All of this is in large part a guess by the authorities. And here the government is saying it wants to invest more to better understand the threat. And that, of course, means better enabling law enforcement, regulators, and banks to respond to that threat. Powers and capabilities. Well, interesting to see the government continues to focus on this. We've seen through the Criminal Finances Act that was enacted, 18 months ago now, that introduces new powers, for instance, the Unexplained Wealth Order, the UWO, that you may be familiar with. The lady from Knightsbridge who bought jewelry from Harrods at fantastic value, millions of pounds. Of course, she's lost that jewelry, and this has been played out before the media and the papers and the news, and you may have picked up some of these snippets around this. Well, that was through an unexplained wealth order. She also lost her golf course in Berkshire and her house in Kensington. And the reason was because the money came from crime. Not in the UK, but in Azerbaijan. But it was sufficient for the courts to say, you know what, we're going to have that. So new powers, the government's looking to build on this, providing new and stronger powers to law enforcement to tackle the threat. And there's no intention to withdraw or to diminish the regulatory approach. Again, the government has invested very significantly. So Valentine, you've said, can I consider the UK approach to anti-money laundering with respect to the Sanctions and AML Act of 2018? Okay, I can, very briefly. But I want to keep it brief because I want to allow some time for the emerging technologies. But here we see, of course, the commitment that the government made last summer reinforces a range of activities over a number of years, including the particular piece of legislation you mentioned in 2018. But that piece of legislation was in large part about maintaining the status quo. It was about recognizing that we were coming away from the EU, and because we were coming away from the EU, we needed to plug a number of gaps that were previously addressed through European law. And so that piece of legislation was created so that we would seamlessly leave the EU without losing capability and clarity over sanctions and wider requirements. So that was the detail of that. I'm reluctant to go into too much more detail because of the amount of time that we have available to us. But there's a lot of information on the internet around that particular piece of legislation, as indeed there is around, for instance, the Criminal Finances Act that I've touched upon and other legal developments. Transparency of ownership is something else that has been subject to keen focus over a number of years. This is about the ability for criminals to hide their assets in companies, in trusts, in other legal arrangements. That has been around for years. We tend to associate it with offshore, don't we? With British Virgin Islands or Cayman Islands, or maybe the Bahamas. But increasingly, it's not just in those sorts of Caribbean territories or Jersey and Guernsey in the Isle of Man. Increasingly, it's here within the UK. It's within the United States and other mainland parts of the world where this ability to hide assets is taking place. And we've seen FATF and globally, the United Nations and a range of other initiatives driving governments to legislate against that, to require companies to offer transparency around ownership, around control, making it much more difficult for criminals to hide their funds. We remember, of course, the Panama Papers. I expect that you'll recall it was very much in the news, wasn't it? About 3 years ago, 4 years ago? Well, this was all about hiding criminal funds offshore. Since then, the Paradise Papers that related to a firm called Applebee's. Again and again, we're seeing criminals exploiting beneficial ownership. But the government here, in its strategic planning from last summer, continues its work to require companies to register owners, to register the controllers. And of course, all of this is required through Companies House. Okay, so finally, we come to the international element of this. And I won't dwell on it, but it recognizes, of course, that the connectivity across the world. Financial services are truly global, and the government here is recognizing that it's not enough for us to operate simply within our boundaries. We need to connect our activity with other law enforcement activity across the world. We need to join up our approach to work collaboratively. And here we see investment overseas to better enable that. Okay, so Valentine, I'm mindful I didn't really fully answer your question around the sanctions and AML Act, but I hope I've given you enough in just saying, look, it was in large part about just ensuring we can continue as we leave the EU. So I'm going to move on now, and we've talked about the financial crime threat. We've talked about the impact of COVID-19. We've touched on Brexit, and we've considered the UK approach to financial crime. Finally, I just want to talk then about emerging technologies. So Yetunde, does the market abuse regulations and its technical standards and guidelines issued by ESMA remain applicable to UK firms in spite of Brexit, or do firms now have to focus on FCA handbook? Yes, and the market abuse regulations. So currently we're going through transition. Yetunde, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, by the way. We're going through this transition, aren't we? And we formally, we have, good. So we formally leave the EU. Currently, we're going through that process of departing the EU, and we're in this transition phase currently. You'd need to consult your regulator to determine whether we're still subject to the market abuse regulations. As you know, those regulations apply directly to UK companies until we are away from the EU fully. A directive, of course, doesn't apply fully, but regulations do. And so those market abuse provisions set by the EU do apply. But let me say this, those market abuse regulations were modeled on the UK approach. So it's very unlikely that there's going to be significant requirement within the MAR that isn't already contained within UK law. So consult the regulator, find out what the position is. We can be confident that it won't be long before we don't need to pay any concern to those regulations, because of course we're leaving the EU, but we are going through this transition at the moment and it isn't entirely straightforward. However, the FCA standard is as high or higher than you have within the EU in any event. Okay, so Yetunde, I don't know if that entirely addresses your question, but I hope that sort of goes some way towards. Emerging technologies then, and I'm going to focus on one or two in particular. Now, can I say, by way of introduction, as I do this, that what I have seen again and again when I talk to colleagues within financial services, within banking, about emerging technologies, thanks, Yetunde, that's good. When I talk to colleagues within banking in particular, I see that some of these technologies, and we're going to talk about AI, we're going to talk about big data, blockchain, and biometrics, that these are seen as somehow almost a dark art. That there's a lot of mystery that surrounds them. What do they mean? What are the practicalities of these technologies? And what kind of a difference will they make? So what I hope to do over the next few minutes is take some of the mystery away from these new technologies, just to explain kind of how they work. Because I think if we can conceptualize the way these technologies work, it becomes a great deal easier to think, well, how can it apply into my particular area? How can it apply within the context of financial services? What difference is this going to make over the next 10 years or so? So I want very briefly to explore some of these areas, and I hope to demystify them, just a small amount. And we start with artificial intelligence. So, of course, this includes robotic process automation as a component within artificial intelligence. It includes machine learning, the idea that a computer can teach itself over time. And we define artificial intelligence as essentially the ability for a computer to replicate human thinking. And there are a number of areas in which we apply this. Visual perception, so we're seeing self-driving cars for the first time in the last few years. Speech recognition has been around for a little time, but now, of course, it's gone to a much higher standard, so that not only do we see computers able to recognize what you're saying, but they can go further and actually recognize who you are. So your speech becomes a means of identification. And we're seeing, of course, computers used in the decision-making process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Before we do, though, I want to share a particular game of chess with you. This is seen as a threshold in the development of artificial intelligence. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this particular chess game. It took place, as you see, in December 2017 between two computers. One, Google Alpha. Romeo, you are great. So I don't know, Romeo, you're very welcome. If you'd like to share some insights to this, it would be great to hear from you. If you prefer not, and I'll carry on. But Romeo, if you'd like, then you can have the microphone. You want me to carry on? Okay. Well then, fair enough. But jump in if you want to add anything, Romeo. So, two computers. One was the reigning world champion. That was Stockfish 8. It was a fantastically powerful computer. It had been programmed with centuries of chess moves and strategies. It was able to process tens of millions of moves every second. And using all that power, it, of course, was the world champion. And it played Google Alpha Zero. Google Alpha Zero was a computer that had been programmed to learn. It had been programmed with the principles of machine learning, artificial intelligence. It had no programming about any chess strategies, moves. It was simply given the rules of the game and nothing else, nothing else. And then it was allowed just 4 hours to play against itself. And then the match took place. 100 separate games took place between these two computers. And you can probably guess the way in which this played out. Of those matches, 68 were drawn, and I understand that's quite common in chess. But the other 32 all won by Google Alpha Zero, this new computer. And it's seen as a threshold in the development of artificial intelligence because you see very, very clearly how much more powerful this new computing technology is. But I want to explore with you, how does it work? What's going on in the computer? And I've thought about this long and hard preparing for this in a previous presentation to try and explain, how does it work? And of course, I don't want to get technical. I'm not going to start talking about binary code and the way in which computers will operate, but conceptually, how does it work? And I stumbled upon this. I can't take credit for this. I stumbled upon this in my research as a way of explaining what's going on. And I thought it was really useful. So I'm going to just do a short experiment with you. And John, I'm going to use yourself, if I may, for these purposes. So John, we want to figure out what music you like. And we're going to use a computer that is programmed in the way that we've been talking about with artificial intelligence to do that. So the computer plays a number of pieces of music to you, John. And the first series of music, well, you don't particularly enjoy it. And the computer then can plot that. So it can use some metrics about the music. So maybe it was the intensity, the tempo of the music, I don't know, something similar. And we can apply metrics to the music, and in that way determine, well, this is the type of music that John does not enjoy, and we can plot it on a graph. But then we play some more music. Maybe it's got higher intensity, higher tempo, and we find that John does enjoy it. So, well, in very simple terms, we can put some boundaries around this, and it would be reasonable for the computer to assume that anything that fell within the lower of those two, that John probably wouldn't enjoy, and anything that fell in the higher, the red area, the likelihood is that John would enjoy that. But what if a piece of music fell there between the two? This for me is much more interesting. Where will it fall? Is John likely to enjoy that or not? It's not in either of those circles. But then, of course, the computer might apply a very similar boundary. And if it did that, well, you would immediately see that there's just one piece of music that John didn't like, and nearly four that John did like using the same boundaries. So on that basis, well, maybe John would enjoy it. Now that's a really basic, simple example of what a computer can do. When we're talking about the kinds of computers we're seeing being developed now, being rolled out across financial services, of course, they are many, many times more powerful, able to simultaneously do a range of different activities. But you can see the principle of the way in which data can be handled and manipulated. But I want to go a little bit further, and here I get quite excited, and I'm actually going to use a prop, if I can find it, for these purposes. And I want to think with you about the way in which we interact with our entertainment systems. So streaming using Netflix or Amazon or some of the other streaming services. Currently, when we put it on, then the system will recommend to us the sorts of programs and films that the system thinks that we will enjoy. And of course, that's based on our previous viewing. But now let's look at this a different way. What if when we watch the films and the programs using Netflix, we're wearing some kind of biometric reader? So here's one that I've got that happens to capture my heart rate and some other biometric details. Now, if that watch is in real time connected to Netflix using a computer, then already there's the technology for Netflix to determine the impact that what it is showing me is having on my body. So if my heart rate goes up, then it's quite possible that I'm enjoying this particular part of the movie or this particular part of the TV series. If I'm falling asleep, again, my heart rate will reflect that, or my blood pressure will reflect that. And Netflix can identify the things that I don't like. Now, with that quality of metrics and an awareness of what causes them from its own catalogue of movies and TV series, it's not difficult to see how Netflix and other streaming services would very quickly determine what we enjoy, perhaps better than we ourselves know. So when in the future it suggests movies and TV series that we should watch, then we're going to take that more seriously because it will know with a great deal of accuracy the things that we respond to. Maybe we'll say to Netflix, I'm in a romantic mood, or I'm in a mood for a thriller, and it will then take that information and determine what we enjoy the most. Now, use that just for a moment in your imagination, and it's not difficult to see that just a few years from now, if this happens, and I think it probably will, that we're going to stop making decisions for ourselves around the TV that we watch, because Netflix knows us better than we know ourselves. So what's the point of trying to decide which movie to watch? Because Netflix quite literally knows better. So very quickly, we're going to leave it with the machine. And if we leave that kind of decision making with the machine, then for me, I think that raises interesting questions around other areas where we're going to switch our brains off, where we're going to potentially coast
Hello? Oh,
through.
sorry. I didn't know my phone was on mute. Hello?
Hello, hello, hello. Are you going to jump in there? Hello? Hello? No? Okay, no worries. I thought we were going to have some comments then, or some questions. That would have been fun. But we're talking about the impact of artificial intelligence, and of course with that big data. So governance and risk, absolutely, Romeo. I agree entirely. And we're seeing, aren't we, the drift towards data and the importance and value of data. People have said it's like the new oil. So companies like Google, Facebook, they are the most powerful companies across the world. If you look at the top 5 companies across the world, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, and the other 2 are digital as well. It's about the value of exploiting and using information. And of course, it can be used for good in the context of compliance, and we'll look at some examples of that. But potentially, of course, it can be used quite the opposite, as a threat to us. Possible increase in financial crime. I couldn't agree more. So this for me is really interesting, but there are wider issues around our own decision making, around civil society, the way in which we conduct and order ourselves. But we need to move on. And what I want to do now is consider this in the context of customer due diligence. So artificial intelligence is powerful. It can do some incredibly powerful and far-reaching processing in very short periods of time. So why wouldn't you apply that in the context of customer due diligence? What you see here is a traditional customer due diligence process. This has kind of been around for years. I was listening to a presentation from the global head of screening for a global bank. I won't say which one, but she was saying that the technology used by the bank to do these processes hasn't fundamentally changed in over 20 years. It's kind of the same as it has been for a long, long time. But we are, of course, seeing the potential for artificial intelligence to have an impact here. And this is the model that we're starting to see, where artificial intelligence is used in a dynamic way. So some startup banks are using this to handle all their due diligence inquiries. Banks like Monzo, for instance, and pockets of global banks just starting to use this approach in order to handle those inquiries. But you see here a very different approach being taken. If we look previously, there were these pillars of activity. So I don't know if this is going to work or not. So pillars of activity. Here you see the pillars around onboarding and account review. Information derived from that is then fed into the customer profile. And then similarly, we've got other feeds into the customer profile around transaction monitoring, screening, and so on. And that profile is interrogated for financial crime compliance purposes, money laundering, sanctions, fraud, terrorist financing, corruption. All of this is essentially interrogating the customer profile to understand where the threat is, to look for patterns and so on. What we see now, though, in this artificial intelligence driven model is a different approach. It's a more holistic approach that looks in real time across a range of different data sources. And you can see some of them mentioned here. So for instance, whereas currently our transaction monitoring is really quite transactional, it's quite binary. It just looks at a handful of accounts and compares it to the past activity of the customer using some algorithms to determine what might be suspicious. Now we're seeing artificial intelligence that's enabling the computer to not just look at that particular series of transactions and compare it to what it knows about the customer, but it looks at that series of transactions and compares it to, for instance, the peer group for the customer, to see what transactions are taking place with the competitors if it's a business, to see what the geolocation says about where people are accessing financial systems from, what social media is saying, LinkedIn, Facebook, what other open source data is saying about markets. So if a business is selling product at a certain price point, what are the other price points that it's being sold at? Is it consistent? Does it make sense? There's a huge amount of data that's available to our systems that are now increasingly being interrogated in real time. All of that adds value. And it means that when the computer generates an alert, that alert is far more likely to relate to actual money laundering or terrorist financing than it has done in the past. So this is a significant change that's affecting the way we do business in the context of wider financial crime compliance. But it links to this issue of big data. That enables us to drill down and look at vast quantities of data that would ordinarily be simply too large, too complex to deal with. This figure is the amount of data being added to the internet every day. It is, of course, vast. There's no surprises here. And what we're seeing now is the ability to handle this vast amount of data with volume. Yes, we can look across all of these different sources. We can do it almost in real time. Whereas in the past, this has taken sometimes hours to process. Not just single sources of data, but we're able to look at many different data points and compare them. We can do that with veracity, with integrity, with reliability. And in that way, we can add value to the data. And of course, we can visualize it. So here's an example. This is actually drawn from the Panama Papers. An entity, I think it's a Chinese entity, was put into the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the ICIJ website. Of course, they published the Panama Papers. You can search using that website, and here we see some of the information that's been brought back from the ICIJ. The point here is this is complex information. It relates to a range of different sources, but we're able to present it visually very quickly using the computing power to manage to bring order and to visualize that data. Moving on, and again, I'm mindful of the time, so I want to do this quite briefly, but we can talk about the blockchain. And this, for me, is even more exciting than artificial intelligence. I don't know how much you're aware of the impact of the blockchain or the distributed ledger, also described. And of course, this is the underpinning technology that enables digital currencies and other virtual assets. But it's not that I think is exciting. It's the many other things that the blockchain is being used for. It's a revolutionary technology, and I'm not overstating that. But let me explain why I say that. And I'm going to very briefly build a blockchain with you, I hope, to demystify it, to explain how it works. So a blockchain is simply a ledger. It's a way of recording information. But there are features about this ledger that are unique. A number of different entities can access the data. They cannot change the data without a record being kept of everything they have done. It is absolutely secure, and when you have changed it, you cannot unchange it. So it is an immutable record of everything that has gone on. So let's add some data to a blockchain, and we'll see why it's significant. So I'm going to put some data on here. Now you can configure your blockchain to add any kind of data. It might be transaction data, it might be fingerprint data, it might be a picture or a diagram or a narrative. It could be a contract. Anything that can be digitized now can be placed on this register. And when you place it on the register or the ledger, then the system records who added that data, who put it on. It records the IP address. So you know the source of the information with absolute confidence. It gives it a hash code, which is effectively a security feature to prevent that data from being tampered with. It then locks it and time and date stamps it. Then it is now an immutable record. Was there someone who wants to come in there? No? Okay, I'll carry on. So coming back to our record, I don't know if anyone was trying to jump on then, but I couldn't quite hear you if you were. Coming back to our record, we're going to add some more data. In the same way, the system is going to record who put the data on, the nature of that data, and it locks in everything else that has gone before, as well as giving it a hash code and time and date stamping it. And we can carry on adding data and adding data, building up our ledger. But on each occasion that we do it, the system is recording who added, who changed the data, when they did it, and it locks it. And simultaneously, it records the data across a range of different ledgers. It's not just held in one place, and this is really significant. It means that no one entity controls the information. It is genuinely shared. Access to it is controlled in terms of how that ledger was set up. But if we wanted to, let's say we represent 3 companies, and the 3 companies want to enter into a contract together, then they can set up that contract on a blockchain. And all 3 companies can have exactly the same access to the information, exactly the same controlled ability to add to it or to adjust the information, to use it as a contract. And the courts are now recognizing this as a form of contract between the relevant parties. So this has a binding effect. It means that information can be shared in a way that is completely trusted. So if we relate this to digital currencies, and we know, of course, that this is where the distributed ledger came from. The blockchain was introduced to the world through Bitcoin. So if I want to make a Bitcoin transaction, how does that ledger become involved? Well, allow again me to explain through an example. If I was going to transfer value to, let's say, I'm going to use yourself again, John, if I may, then in some ways it could be straightforward. I could transfer value from my digital wallet and direct it to John's digital wallet, moving in the context of a Bitcoin transaction. But this raises the question, how do we know that that transaction has been properly effected? How do we know that my digital wallet has been reduced by a certain amount and that John's has been increased by the equivalent? And of course, this is where the ledger comes in. So when I direct the movement of value from my digital wallet to John's, automatically the distributed ledger or the blockchain first of all determines, do I have the value in the first instance? Because my wallet, my digital wallet is recorded on the blockchain. It confirms that I have the value, and then it credits that value to John's digital wallet and updates both records, all of which are kept on the distributed ledger. And it does that entirely automatically. And of course, it simultaneously captures all of that information across many ledgers around the world. There are thousands of Bitcoin ledgers, all of which record identical information. So it's a trusted transaction. In that way, it doesn't require banks. It doesn't require intermediaries. So if John, if you were overseas and I wanted to send you value, then the likelihood is it would involve 4 banks: my bank, your bank, and correspondent banks in order to facilitate that transaction overseas. But here we can transfer value to the other side of the world almost instantly without the use of any intermediaries. And that, of course, is why digital currencies are so attractive, or it's one of the reasons. But the blockchain has so many other uses, and we were talking about this before. And it's the reason I get so excited about it. Not only can it be used for transactions, but of course it can be used for contracts. We've talked about that. It can be used for healthcare. So increasingly we're seeing health services putting patient records onto a blockchain. And GP surgeries, hospitals, whatever authorized, whoever is authorized can then access that central blockchain record with absolute confidence around the integrity of the information. And of course, it can then update it. There's no longer a requirement to write to the GP surgery to say this treatment has taken place and notifying the relevant GP, updating all the records. Now, one central record is used by all the providers. I could go on, but let me just provide one more example and then we're going to finish off. And that is when I go to the supermarket. So I might buy an orange from the supermarket, and on that orange is a barcode. So I can scan that barcode, perhaps using my mobile phone, and that will tell me that it's an orange, and maybe it will tell me what the price of that is. But then look to the future. Using the blockchain, I scan that barcode, and it can tell me not just the price of the orange, the make of the orange or the type, but where it was grown, when it was picked, when it left the country of origin, who transported it, when it arrived into this country, when it arrived at the supermarket, maybe even when it was put on a shelf. All of that data can be captured with absolute confidence on a blockchain. Now, you might say, I'm really not that interested in the oranges that I buy, and you'd probably be right. But now apply the same principle to the machine gun that you're buying as a member of the military. So you're acquiring firearms. You're buying a machine gun. Now you look at that unique identifier on the machine gun, and it will tell you where it was manufactured, when it was produced, who manufactured it, and who has owned it ever since that point of manufacture. Because again, the entire supply chain is transparent and it's kept on a blockchain. I could go on, it's a really exciting area, but I'm mindful that we need to move on. We're seeing this in the context of financial services. The R3 group, which comprises about 80 different financial services, are working together to use the blockchain for accounts, for customer due diligence. This is a really powerful way of managing compliance issues. So a good example of that might be around due diligence. We know that we can record due diligence inquiries, information, source of funds, source of wealth onto a blockchain. Now, when the customer goes to another bank under open banking provisions, then their records should go with them. And of course, if that record is held on a blockchain, you can have absolute confidence in the integrity of that for the features that I've explained to you. So now when you're undertaking due diligence because you're onboarding this new customer, you've got a fantastic wealth of information available to you that should shortcut many of the requirements. It means that our processes can be expedited, can be seamlessly moved from one bank or one financial service to another. And that's what the R3 group is working on. Just to finish though, biometrics is another area that of course is changing significantly. We've touched on some of those already. Voice recognition, that now is used as a means of verification. Interestingly, we're seeing that the criminals are exploiting that. There have been cases where criminals have recorded CEOs giving presentations and then use that using artificial intelligence to replicate the voice of a CEO and, for instance, make a call to an employee pretending to be the CEO and asking for funds to be moved or something similar. And of course, the employee on the telephone recognizes their CEO's voice and will very quickly do what they've been asked to do, even if it's to transfer large amounts of money. So the criminals are exploiting this, and of course that will always happen. But other biometric measures, again, we've talked about heartbeat, we've talked about blood pressure, but those biometrics that can be used as a form of identification, well, that includes fingerprints, and you can see here reference to DNA, blood, typing patterns. I find this fascinating. But now there are companies around the world that can identify an individual simply from the way in which they interact with their iPhone or their mobile device. It's very unique. The angle that we hold it at, the hand that we use, the finger that we use, the patterns that we use to navigate around our applications. All of this is unique to us and can be used as a form of identification. So biometrics is a big area. Just to wrap up then, and then come to your questions. We've talked about artificial intelligence as a game changer. And of course, this is coupled to big data, vast amounts of information that are available to us in real time. The blockchain that, for the first time, enables transactions, contracts, a range of different activities to take place on the internet that simply couldn't happen before because we can trust the data that we hold. And we've talked briefly about biometrics and their use. So your questions then. Before I come to them though, I've forgotten about this. It's worth just touching on what's coming next. And I'm sure that some of you will be familiar with quantum computing. There's, I think, about a dozen quantum computers around the world currently. And these, of course, use a different technology. Traditional computing uses binary code, 0 ones. But now we're seeing quantum computers that can use a third character. It's neither a 0 nor a 1, but it is both at the same time. And more than that, it's a spectrum. So it is anything from 0 all the way up to 1, but anything in between. So this increases the power of computers exponentially because they have so much more power available to them because they can use more than 2 digits. The limiting factor for quantum computing is currently, for it to be effective, it needs to take place at just fractionally above 0 degrees Kelvin, which is as cold as it can be. It is minus 273 degrees centigrade. It is colder than outer space. So these quantum computers are very rare, they're hugely expensive, but they are incredibly powerful. Okay, so coming to your questions. This is what we've covered so far. I'm going to talk about the ICA before I finish, but you've got some questions here, and I'm going to read it from the chat box. And John, thank you for inviting these questions. So Dale, you said, do you think blockchain effectiveness would subject all data being on the same platform? Okay, I'm not sure I quite follow. So are you saying, could you, for instance, access blockchain from Microsoft and separately from Adobe and separately from other means? Or could you enter data from a number of different platforms, or maybe different languages? And the truth is, I don't know, but I suspect there's no reason technically why you shouldn't be able to do that, as long as it can be distilled down to a common language or a common format that can be recorded on the blockchain. It really depends how you set your blockchain up. There isn't a single formula. There isn't a single way in which blockchains can be created. It's very much for the individual company or the individual to set up their blockchain to achieve the purpose they want to use it for. So I don't think it is subject to that, but you'd have to look a little bit more closely. So Joey, you've said capturing personas. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. So I don't know if you want to expand on that, Joey, but whilst you do on that, Dale, you've said, what about privacy? And this is really interesting because, of course, we're seeing quite rightly a focus on provisions under data protection. Within the EU, there's data protection regulations. Already within the UK, there's very strong data protection. And of course, this raises a question around, well, will the blockchain undermine that? Now, we know that in order to be compliant with data protection provisions, then companies, as they capture our data, must tell us that they're keeping the data and the purpose they're keeping it for. So as long as companies are doing that, then they can hold the data in whatever format. There is a question, though, over redundancy. So data protection requires companies to delete the data when it is no longer required. But if that data is on a blockchain, does that mean you delete the entire blockchain? Or can you delete segments of the blockchain along the way? And this is the sort of thing that the R3 group has been focusing upon, to try and understand how you manage this technology within the constraints of our current legal system. So Dale, it's a really good question, the privacy issues, and these are being addressed currently. Yutunde, so you said about red flags. What will be a responsible threshold for determining when the use of a PO box address becomes suspicious? Okay, so a hotelier with a chain of 6 hotels uses the same PO address for all the hotels. Would that be abnormal? And how would the business team get comfortable with the arrangement? Well, of course, now we've kind of pivoted, Yutunde, into another area altogether, and that is around what is reasonable and the way in which company details, registration details can be recorded and verifiable. Now, if a company of 6 hotels uses a single PO address, I think it would be reasonable to ask, well, why? And if you're talking about this in the context of due diligence, then I expect you will ask the company, why are you using this particular PO address? What physical address can you provide us with? Who are the individuals that are involved in, for instance, managing, in running the company? And what is the company ownership? So this would just prompt a range of additional questions if I was doing the due diligence. I don't think I would want to just accept on face value the use of a PO box address, particularly if it's for 6 companies. But of course, it is going to depend on the circumstances. John, so if I can move on, I'm mindful of the time. So actually, before I come to John, there's a question there around looking at a situation where blockchain is used for CDD. Actually, we've just scrolled down a little bit. Looking at a situation where blockchain is used for CDD, if all the customer information is not on the same platform, there would be a gap. Well, potentially, but with emerging technologies, increasingly, they are able to take data in a number of different formats to provide consistency around that data and to record it in perhaps different formats. So there wouldn't need to be a gap. I think someone mentioned NLP early on in the presentation. I don't know who it was, but this ability for computers now to see natural language, to capture it in a standard way, even though the input wasn't through a standard mechanism. So I expect that computers in time will be able to use data from a range of different sources to standardize it and use it within the blockchain. John, you've asked, do you think AI or emerging technology will complement our jobs or be a threat to our jobs? Well, that I think is the question to ask. Absolutely the question. And there are a number of different answers that people are sharing. One looks at history. And so if you go back to the agricultural revolution, so way back, centuries back, from the time when human beings moved from being hunter-gatherers to settling in one place and to farming particular areas of land. That was a revolution. And you could argue that the case could be made that that would make the hunter-gatherers redundant. But of course, those same people were deployed now on the farms. Now, when the Industrial Revolution took place, there were predictions that with all this machinery, that there wouldn't require human beings in the same way. But actually what we saw was human beings were moving from the countryside into the towns, and they were used within the factories. So that prediction didn't come true. More recently, we've seen with the information revolution, predictions around computers taking the place of human beings in the same way. But actually, we've seen again that the jobs have changed, but there is still a requirement for employment. So some people argue that it will just change the nature of the work rather than removing the need for human interaction. I personally am not convinced by that. I think that there is good reason to believe that the power of computers is going to start to displace human beings. And it's more and more difficult to find jobs that require human engagement. Computers now can take the place of doctors, can take the place of drivers. In the future, they will be able to take the place of compliance officers to a large extent. So is it a threat? Personally, I think it absolutely is, and it's one that we need to take seriously. If it was, I'm towards the end of my career. If I was younger in service, the question I would be focusing on is what skills do I require to adjust to the changing market? Because I think there will be jobs, but the nature of those jobs will change and maybe there will be greater competition for them. So I need to position myself with the right skills so I can move from my current role in compliance into a complementary role where there is still a need for human beings to undertake the work. It's interesting as I've talked to banks like HSBC about the way in which they recruit their staff. And I was talking to one lead in human resources, and she was saying that one of the things HSBC is looking for is agility. This is the ability to move between roles. It's no longer a single job for life. We can't get a job in compliance and expect it to be there in 20 years' time. Whereas perhaps when I first started in my career, that was kind of the case. You kind of knew where you were going and where you would be for decades. That's no longer the position. So, John, I think your question is exactly the right one. And the way I would suggest we respond to it is by considering what are the skills for tomorrow's professional, the tomorrow's compliance or anti-money laundering officer, and focus my attention in those areas. Okay, so Afaya, you've said the PO box is usually in the business risk appetite. Some accept it, some don't. So yeah, that kind of makes sense. Is accepting a customer using a PO box within risk appetite? I think that's going to depend on the context, though. So if you're onboarding a high risk entity, I'm going to suggest it's very unlikely that you will accept a PO box as a basis for their registration or their location. But if you're routinely onboarding a very low risk entity, then it may be within risk appetite. Joey, you've said you don't know if it's the right forum. The question is based on data analytics. How much repetitive processes would you think could be automated? And what advice someone who wants to delve into robotics, how do you help this in someone's financial crime career? What's the future for human intervention around due diligence? Well, actually, I think I've kind of answered some of that already. But in terms of the boundaries for this, the extent to which the computer can take over from human beings, I think it's actually very difficult to see where the limits are. Where do you need human beings as against a computer? Perhaps in the softer skills. So that's in human interaction, the bedside manner, the ability to communicate. But even that is limited. So let's take an example of interviewing someone. You might say, well, look, if you're going to interview a suspect, you can't use a computer for that. It needs human interaction. It needs the ability to read non-verbal signals. It needs the ability to make judgments that only human beings can make. But and John, I'll come to your question in a moment. But I'm going to suggest that computers are already better than human beings at doing many of those things. So computer can read your body language far more accurately than a human being can. And that's all intuition is. Intuition is just the ability to read body language without necessarily knowing why and how you are reading it. A computer can look at your heartbeat, your heart rate. It can look at the way in which you're sweating, the movement of your body, the way in which you're holding yourself, and is able to make accurate judgments based on that. Okay, so I'm mindful that I'm well over time. John, you very kindly invited me just to talk about the ICA. I'm not going to labor this because I believe in the ICA. I would do, I guess, because I'm the head of financial crime for it. But I'm confident that if you want training in any area of compliance, in governance, but also in financial issues, financial risk, financial crime, there is no better place to go. And that's why I don't need to labor this. I'll suggest if you're interested in any of these courses, please have a look at our website. You'll see that there's a range of different courses that are shown here on this slide, ranging from certificate all the way through to postgraduate diploma. A benchmark is our diploma in anti-money laundering, A benchmark is also in the context of financial crime prevention in that diploma. That gives you a standard that is recognized across the world. It's accredited by the University of Manchester, so we're externally accredited for what we do. And funnily enough, I'm meeting with the university tomorrow so that they can audit the training that we provide and ensure that it's of the right standard. So I personally absolutely believe in all of these qualifications. I'd encourage you, if you're looking to develop your career within compliance, or perhaps to move to look at compliance, then consider these that will absolutely help you to achieve that goal. There's no guarantee, there never can be a guarantee, but it will help you to obtain accreditation for the understanding that you have, a qualification that you can reflect, and letters that you can put after your name. So have a look at our website and see how that can help you. So Akinyemi, you've asked, is there a certificate of attendance for this? Well, no, it's not set up as part of your continuous learning. That is something, again, that the ICA is doing. We're establishing new capabilities that will actually support people's ongoing development, as well as offering them one-off courses. By all means, you can reflect this within your CPD as an hour and a half with the ICA, but there's no certificate to support that. Because it's simply an informal presentation that I was invited to provide to like minds by John. Okay, so look, is there anything else that I can help you with? Any other questions around anything that we've covered this evening? If not, then I'm be only too pleased to pick up any queries that you might have, particularly if it relates to our qualifications. Have a look at our website. I personally believe in it, and I'm sure that you'll find it useful within your career. And it kind of sells itself. I don't feel I need to push it too hard. Doyen, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure joining you this evening. I hope it's been useful. I think John has very kindly offered to send out a PDF version of the slides if you're interested, so you can access that and pick up any of the information that you've seen that I've shared with you this evening. You're very welcome. Julie, Adesina, Tifedi, Show, Romeo, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure joining you this evening. So if there's nothing else, then I will head off.
Yeah, I just want to say a huge thanks, team, for taking time to do this presentation. I think it was very professionally done. I think I gave you one of my best webinars I think I've been to without patronizing you, but it was very, very clear, very concise. Apart from KYC, you touched on emerging technology, so it's very, very informative, and we really appreciate your time. So for the benefit of all the attendees, this was put together by, hosted by Like Minds. We are a professional network, mainly Africans based in the city. And then you can touch base with us. I've sent a few information about how you can reach out to us on our websites. We did another webinar on blockchain. That's about 4 or 5 weeks ago. So if you want to listen to that webinar on blockchain, I think very, very informative, very good. You could log onto our website, and a few of the webinars will be uploaded currently there. Even this webinar, we hope to put it in the website also, so that you could have access to listen to it all over again. I think that's something I will do myself. So feel free to drop us an email on to get requests for the course slides. I've sent you an email address where you can reach out to us. And yeah, if you want to get regular updates on our webinars, I've sent our LinkedIn group link as well, and you could request to become a member then in the group on LinkedIn. By doing that, you get regular updates on the various webinars, so that you don't miss out on any useful one or you could drop us an email as well. We could add to the group, and you get regular feedback or regular updates on most of our webinars we'll be organizing. We are hoping to do another webinar in more detail. We're looking at emerging technology. I think we're not through with that yet, but thanks, team, for touching base on that topic. It's very, very good. We also want to run other topics in more detail, even in looking at artificial intelligence and robotics process automation. So we're going to be doing that in a couple of weeks and months to come. So just watch this space. And then thank you, everyone. Feel free to drop us an email with your feedback or put your feedback on the chat. And I think that's very useful as well for us to know that, yes, you find this very, very useful. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, team, once again. And have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, team.
Cheerio, bye-bye. Thank you very much. Good to meet you all.
Thank
Cheerio,
you very
bye-bye.
much, Tim.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you
very much,
John and Tim.
Thank you very much, John.
That was an awesome training. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Let me send something. Give me one second. So I'll send you.
Shivamoti, well done.
Oh, thank you. I wish I was the chief. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. For
all right now.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much. All right, cheers, eh? We'll talk later.
Yes.
All right, cheers. Thanks, everyone. Well, lawyer, Igwe.
I remain lawyer, sir.
Thanks for joining.
I
Good to
remain
see
lawyer.
you. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. I hope it was
Top notch. Top
was
notch.
top notch, right?
Top
Even
notch.
me too. I think I was very impressed. Very impressed.
Top notch.
All right, we'll talk soon next week. Hopefully, when we have a Stay Connected session.
Yeah, what we do our connect. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Have a good day, everyone. We'll talk soon.
Yeah. Bye.
Yeah.